Welkom bij deel 2 van onze eindejaar special vanwege het wereldkampioenschap natuurlijk van Max Verstappen. En waarin we vorige week ook hebben teruggekeken naar wat komt er allemaal bij, hoeveel mensen werken er in zo'n team, enzovoort, enzovoort. Vandaag gaan we het specifiek hebben over onder andere de pitstop. Maar voor eerst, ook zij zijn niet weggelopen, want we hebben dit in één uitzending opgenomen. Dus we zitten er nog.
Ja, gelukkig.
Piet Hofman, Daniel van Aken en Gerard Sierach. Jongens, fijn dat jullie het nog hebben volgehouden.
Ja, dankjewel.
En we gaan nu eigenlijk eerst even kijken, dan kunnen we het daarna even over hebben, over de pitstops. Waarom die zo belangrijk zijn geweest. En met name wie de pitstops ooit zo bedacht heeft zoals ze nu gedaan wordt. En dat is een zekere Gordon Murray. Kijk even mee.
Max, you have 1.92 seconds to burst as many balloons as you can. Are you ready?
No.
3, 2, 1, go.
They are not
You have 1.92 seconds to stack as many plastic cups as you can. Are you ready?
born.
3, 2, 1, go.
I thought it was going to be a lot easier than that. Wow.
You have 1.92 seconds to do a small child's puzzle. Are you ready?
Yep.
3, 2, 1, go. Two, three, four, 5 pieces.
Yeah. No, I sort of missed.
It was
sort of
missing
missed the slots.
Well, pit stops in the late 70s had never been considered really. Pit stops were, as they were throughout the 60s and 70s, they were an evil. You only pit stopped if you had an issue with the car really and tried to fix the car. Strategic pit stops was what I started in the early 80s. Now I'm always looking for the next advantage. So in the 70s there weren't really any strategic pit stops at all. So if you had to come in and change tyres or try and fix the car, you had very slow, there were no air guns, there were no quick lift jacks. So you had, like torque wrenches and spanners on the wheels. And it just took a long time. So the strategic pit stops just didn't exist. That was a brand new thing in the early 80s. Well, I'm always looking for the next advantage. I'm a bit like that. I think my hero when I was growing up was Colin Chapman, and I sort of saw myself as a Colin Chapman type guy, which always looking for the next sort of advantage. So I used to read the rule book to death and try and find a way, a loophole or a way around the regs for that sort of unfair advantage, if you like. And I was chatting with David North, who was in those days, believe it or not, just two of us in the design office. Now they have hundreds, I know, just the two of us. And we were chatting about it, and I was thinking about the weight. I was always interested in weight saving. and 1 pound of weight equated to exactly 100th of a second a lap, and that was pretty constant. So it didn't take long to do the mathematics and think, well, hold on a minute, you know, the fuel is a huge percentage of the car weight. So if you could halve that weight and go X many seconds a lap quicker, you could, if you had a really quick, efficient pit stop, you could stop halfway through the race and then win the race just on the reduced weight. But there were other advantages too that I thought about. One was half a tank of fuel, the centre of gravity is lower, of course, so the car's a little bit quicker every lap as well. But the other big one was tyres, because we knew we put tyres on at the beginning of the race and they degraded slowly during the race, so you were going faster because of the lower weight, but actually not as quick as you could have gone because the tyres were going off. And we knew when you put a new set of tyres on, they were 1, 2, 2.5 seconds a lap quicker for the first 5 or 10 laps. So what I did was I did quite a complex equation, which was the weight reduction, the centre of gravity height reduction, and the new tyre advantage, and came up with a bogey time of about 26 seconds that we had to beat to make race winning with strategic pit stops. Okay, but it's all very well having these theories and strategic plans, but of course in practice they are massive problems to overcome, and particularly in this case because trying to get up to 30 gallons of fuel into the car in pit stop time was virtually impossible, because we were still filling cars with churns, aluminium milk cans we used to call them in those days. So you put a funnel in the filler and you pulled the churn into the car and you started the race, so that obviously wasn't going to work in a pit stop. And the other issue was the tyres only work when they get up to speed. And you know, you need 2 or 3 laps to get the tyre temperature into the tyre, and those 2 or 3 laps you're going several seconds a lap slower, so that obviously wasn't going to work. And then of course the other big problem was getting the wheels changed in a very short space of time and getting the car jacked up very quickly and lowered safely. In addition to that, because we had the BMW turbocharged engine, we had a problem. When the engine came in hot and stopped, the turbocharger bearing would seize because it had no oil flow around the outside of the casing. And of course, if you stop for more than about 5 seconds, the turbo seized. So we had all those problems to try and overcome. I think all the strategy behind the stop was done with myself and David North, who was the only other designer in the office. And then, of course, once we started working with the team, we had a very good team of people. I started taking video footage of stops. Very early days for video in those days, taking video footage, and then we'd sit down as a team and watch the video and actually analyse each operation of a wheel change, for example, to see where we could make that quicker. So what we came up with for the wheel changing is we had air guns. We redesigned the hub and the nut on the car so that the nut for the new wheel was already in the gun. We had spare air guns on the side, and we involved the whole team in those sort of detail bits. And then to get the car up and down quickly, we designed very lightweight titanium air jacks. So we had one of the guys on the back of the car with a probe, so when the car stopped, stuck the probe in the back of the car, opened the air jack, and the car was up instantly, and then of course down instantly at the end. And we had an idea to cool the turbo bearing, because it was an airline obviously that blew the air jacks up. We took a tiny line off that and had an air jet on the turbo bearing housing, so as soon as the car stopped and the guy jacked the car up, there would be air cooling the turbo bearing, and that's how we got over that. So the car jacking up and down and the turbo bearing was one solution, and then of course all the paraphernalia to change the wheel quickly. And the guys, we worked very closely as a team to work out how many people we needed to take the wheel on and the wheel off and that sort of stuff. Well, of course, the guys, I mean, Brabham was a fantastic little team. We were giant killers. I loved it. You know, we had a tiny proportion of the budget from, say, McLaren or Ferrari or Williams. But we won Grand Prix and we won World Championships. And so the whole team loved the giant killing aspect of it. Bernie Ecclestone was always up for something that was, like me, an advantage and something that pissed other people off as well. We both liked that. So the whole team was just up for it, absolutely up for it. And of course, when I sat them down and explained this bogey time of 26 seconds, that we had to include it in the slowing down coming into the pits, the stop time, the going out time, and getting the tyres and the driver back up to full speed, had to be, if that was less than 26 seconds, we were going to win every race, basically. And if it was more than 26 seconds, it was touch and go. If it was a lot more than 26 seconds, we were lost. So all the effort from the design strategy and the team was on getting that bogey time, if you like, down to under 26 seconds, and we achieved it quite easily with all these ideas. Well, the first time we arrived with all the paraphernalia was for the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch in '82. Because what we had done is we converted BT50s, which was that current BMW car. This was ahead of doing the 52, which won the championship. And we started halfway through the season, or 2/3 of the way through the season, with pit stops. And of course, the other paraphernalia is the two other things we had to achieve were tyre heating and getting the fuel in quickly. And the tyre heaters, in those days, there weren't any tyre heaters. There'd never been tyre heaters in Formula One. I was the first one to bring in tyre heating. But we didn't have the nice little electric blankets they have now that you wrap around the tyre. So we built a huge plywood blue tower that could take 2 rears and 2 fronts in a stack. And we had a gas heater blowing in the bottom and a chimney out the top, and a couple of little windows round each tyre so we could prod them and make sure we hadn't overcooked them. And we did overcook them quite a few times. The compound went off, so you had to throw that set away. So we arrived at Brands Hatch with these blue TARDIS-like looking things in a row, and people were wondering what the hell they were. And the other thing we haven't talked about, of course, is the pressure refueling. And that was 2 beer barrels, the aluminium beer kegs. And we worked out that we could refuel at 2 bar, and we could get 30 gallons in 3 seconds, which was pretty spectacular. But to do that, we needed a very big diameter hose, so the poor guys had to practice a lot with this hose over their shoulder, and you had a filler on one side of the car and a breather on the other side. And when you opened the valve, it was just a rumble, almost like an explosion, and the car just went 30 gallons in 3 seconds. So we turned up with those barrels on trolleys and these blue TARDIS boxes and all this kit and air guns and air jacks, and people wondered what the hell was going on, It would be a very large fuel tank, 30 gallons, wouldn't it? So you're probably putting in almost twice your normal hatchback fuel tank, which takes a couple of minutes at a petrol station. So 2 of those would be 4 minutes or something, and this all happens in 3 seconds. So it was really quite dramatic. And I had to involve the guys a lot in that, because we tried all sorts of fancy mechanical interlocks, because if the guy put the filler on the car before the breather was coupled, you would just blow the car to smithereens. I mean, literally, with 2 bar pressure and an aluminium and carbon monocoque. So we had to have a safety device, and we tried all sorts of fancy mechanical ideas where it stopped you putting the thing, but they were all complicated and could go wrong. And in the end, we just decided with the team, with the guys, eye contact over the car was the best thing. So the guy with the breather didn't look up until he had the breather connected, and then he would look up, because they were leaning together. The faces were only probably this far apart. So the filler guy didn't put the filler on until he saw the whites of the eyes of the breather guy, and that worked perfectly, actually. But except for an instance in Paul Ricard, where we blew a car to pieces because we had the breather fitted facing downwards instead of upwards.
The 2 Brabham drivers have arrived at a very interesting situation, and should they go the full distance, and Piquet is in the pit.
Yeah, this is it. Nelson Piquet now, for the first time, you see the much expected Brabham pit stop. We didn't get a stopwatch on it, I'm afraid, because we were looking at Nigel Mansell, but it's a very quick one. There is the fuel going in, and you can see that the mechanics have all got fireproof suits on. The car is up on its own pneumatic jacks. Nelson Piquet came into the pits in the lead, in second position, and he is therefore rejoining the race, but with fuel tank topped up and on new tyres.
Well, this was actually before we started racing with pit stops, or certainly in the early days. It was before 1983 anyway, and we had developed, I think David North was the development guy on that, and developed an even bigger breather and filler to try and get the fuel in even quicker. And the new part arrived at Paul Ricard and had to be fitted to the car. But the guys, of course, had never seen it before. It was a brand new bit, and the breather was supposed to crank up towards the top of the tank to clear the air all until it was full of fuel. And they fitted it the wrong way around. They fitted it downwards. So we dumped in the tank full of fuel with 2-bar pressure, and of course, as soon as it got to the breather, fuel had nowhere to go. And we had a mechanic sitting in the car, and it literally blew the car to pieces, and we were all standing around in shorts and t-shirts, and it had thrown a column of 30 gallons of fuel up in the air, which nobody saw. We just heard the explosion. So everybody's looking at each other, and it came down as a vapor, and we all got completely covered in fuel vapor. So it could have been a disaster, really. I look back, there's a famous photograph of the first time we actually got through a race, because all through 1982 the engine was very unreliable. In those days we were still learning with BMW on the engine, and we kept blowing up engines and turbos and all sorts of things. So we never got to the end of the race. So we gave away our secret for nearly half a season during that. But I look back on those photographs now, and I've got all the boys dressed in fireproof overalls and helmets, and I'm standing in front of the car in shorts and a short sleeve shirt, because I did what they now call the lollipop man in front of the car. You know, I did that. I stood in front of the car and looked at the driver in the eyes and said, "Hold it until we were ready to go." But it was so dodgy thinking back, you know. But you don't think about that at the time, because you're just looking to get the advantage. The thing that was banned after the first year was pressure refueling, which was actually quite right, because you know that was pretty dangerous stuff. But then, of course, pit stops went on for many years after that, and then the refueling was banned after a few fires and accidents and things. I think, you know, Formula One goes through eras. I think the strategic stopping for tyres and refueling, which we started in '82, really has changed Formula One forever, if you think about it, because the whole race now is based on tyre strategy and how many stops and undercuts and all that sort of stuff. I used to love the strategy. Nowadays you see these pictures with 40 guys sitting at computers. I had an A4 spreadsheet where we filled in the circuit lap times, the circuit length, the weather conditions, the tyres we had available, and we did a very simple calculation to see how many laps we would go on tyres. We generally went about 70% of the distance, which people could never understand when other people started doing pit stops. They would go half distance. But the reason I went 70% was because if you do the calculations, you could run the car right down to the ragged edge on minimum weight, because normally in those days we didn't have sophisticated computers measuring the fuel usage, so we had to calculate how much fuel you had. So you always left about 4 or 5 kilos of fuel in the car at the end, so you didn't run out of fuel and you weren't underweight. But if you ran 70% of the distance, you could then put in just the extra 10 litres of fuel at the stop to make sure the car would be overweight, so you'd be running right on the weight limit for 2/3 of the race. The only time we changed that is when we won the championship. At the end, we were up against the turbo Renaults, and we went to the last race at Kyalami for the South African Grand Prix, and Renault put masses of effort. It was ours to lose and theirs to win, really. We had to win the last race to win the championship. And they all knew by then we did 2/3 race distance on fuel. But what I did with PK is I only put a few gallons of fuel in PK. So he would demoralize Prost and the Renault and disappear into the distance, and they would basically give up, and just hope something went wrong. And it worked perfectly. We just put, I think, 10 gallons in. PK came around in the lead, 2.5 seconds in the lead on the first lap, and Renault backed off for sure. And then, of course, PK came in on lap 10 or something and refueled. And so we sort of pulled everybody's bluff on that one. I think the early pit stops in the 50s when Grand Prix racing started, they had to refuel because the races were much, much longer. The races were 300 miles in some cases, certainly much more than 2 hours. So they had to refuel. But again, I don't think anybody had stopped. I'm sure, actually, looking back, anybody had stopped to see how that could be turned to a strategic advantage. The only thing you could do would be perhaps to stop a little bit earlier or a little bit later. And in those days, they used to drag the driver out of the car, chuck another driver in if they thought they could win the race. But I genuinely believe the pit stops that we started at Brabham were the first real strategic pit stops designed to try and win the race. They had to stop for fuel in those days, so all they could do is try and make it as quickly as possible. And probably they had a little window where they could, maybe stop 2 laps earlier or 2 laps later, but that was about it. So I think the Brabham pit stops were the first real strategic pit stops in Grand Prix racing.
En voor u thuis, om even te kijken van wie was nou Gordon Murray. Nou, Gordon Murray was de ontwerper van onder andere Brabham en McLaren. Dat is zeg maar de Adrian Newey is dat nu bij Red Bull. Die ontwerpt dus de auto's. Die bedenkt hoe je het chassis maakt, hoe je de ophanging doet enzovoort meer. Hij was dat bij Brabham en bij McLaren. En hij heeft bij Brabham 4 wereldtitels en 2 constructeurtitels binnengesleept.
Nou, kan je
en
wat.
bij McLaren 5 wereldtitels en 5 constructeurstitels. Onder de coureurs waren onder andere 3 titels bij van Ayrton Senna. Dus ook niet
ja, zo kan ik het ook.
maar
Denk je?
je zag dus duidelijk in die film ongelooflijk hoe ze dus met vroeger erbij liepen in de pits. Dat hij zegt,
Ja,
we
kort broekje,
liepen
lekker.
korte broek. En
Maar dat is vast wel een paar keer misgegaan, zo?
het is ook misgegaan.
Ja.
Dat vertelde hij dus ook met die vuurzee. En toen hebben ze op een gegeven moment beschermende kleding werd ingevoerd. Maar het is allemaal ontwikkeling geweest.
Ja.
Hè?
Is het niet bij Jos Verstappen geweest ooit een keer?
Ja, die stond ook op
Die stond ook een keer
in de barbecue.
Dat weet ik
helemaal
nog wel, ja.
van top tot teen.
Ja.
Die stond ook in de barbecue stand.
Ja,
Meer recentelijk natuurlijk, maar dat had er niet met bijtanken te maken, want dat doen we al jaren niet meer. Maar dat natuurlijk met Grosjean, hè?
Ja.
2 jaar geleden.
Grosjean.
Dat je die vlam ook niet zag, zeg maar. Was dat niet?
Nee, klopt dat die
blauwe
al
Wel. Hij was dwars door de vangrail gereden.
Oh, die.
En normaliter
Nou,
mag
ik
zo'n
heb
brandstoftank-
een keer zo'n pitsbrand gezien, dan zag je de vlammen gewoon niet.
Nee, maar dat is bij die
Dan zie je
Amerikaanse
iedereen
races.
springen.
Ah ja,
Ja.
in Indianapolis.
Nee,
Ja, dan zie je
Ja.
iedereen springen en denken, wat zijn die aan het doen?
Ja,
Ja,
maar
dat
die-
ding dus in de fik.
Dat heeft ook een beetje te maken met de brandstof die ze gebruiken.
ja, dat
Het is iets
kan.
andere brandstof, ze hebben een iets hogere ontbrandingstemperatuur.
Je ziet niks.
Nee, je ziet niks. Met,
Wat zou je dan doen dan?
ja, maar er staat alles in de fik hoor. Echt flink in de fik.
Ja, en ook redelijk heet, zeg maar.
Ja,
Je ziet wel lui heen en weer springen daar hoor. Dan. Op.
Nee, dat is zeker zo.
Maar
goed,
ja.
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 Een van de dingen waar dus wat eigenlijk uit die hele pitstopstrategie is overgebleven, is dat hele bandenverhaal. Vroeger, dat heeft hij uitgebreid uitgelegd, dus gaan we niet weer herhalen. Deden ze dus in het begin eerst een race gewoon op 1 set banden. En nu hadden ze dus de optie om meer banden te gaan wisselen. En toen hebben ze later bedacht van dan is het ook wel handig om niet zoveel benzine erin te doen. Dan doen we halverwege de race nog een beetje erbij. En sommigen die deden alleen wat later ook heette een dash en splash. Even het aftoppen van de benzinetank om nog 2 rondjes even te kunnen rijden.
Ja.
Nou, dat is tegenwoordig natuurlijk niet meer aan de orde. Hè. We hebben geen tanken meer tijdens de race. Dat is afgeschaft een aantal jaren
Ze moeten nog
geleden.
een klein beetje overhouden in het tankje.
Ja.
Als ze aan het eind zijn. Dat is
Ja.
nog verplicht.
Ja.
Moet
En
wel.
En het record van Red Bull zal tot in de eeuwigheid waarschijnlijk blijven. Want je mag niet meer onder de 2 seconden. Of 2 seconden en 4 geloof ik.
2,1 volgens mij.
2,1 ja. Nou, en ze deden het afgelopen race al een pitstop in 2,2.
Ja.
Dus ze zitten er alweer dicht op.
Ze doen het rustig aan, dus zeg maar.
Ja, voor hun is dat rustig aan. Ja. Onvoorstelbaar. Ja. Maar een van de dingen wat natuurlijk cruciaal was in die snelle bandenwissel is natuurlijk die wielmoer, die wielbout en de wheelgun. Ja. Nou, en daar heeft met name Red Bull, die heeft daar een hele mooie uitleg toen over gegeven over de ontwikkeling van de wielbout.
What we have here is 11 years of wheel nut development in pit stops ever since the beginning of Red Bull racing. I think perhaps you could probably divide them into 2 sections really. The section that was refueling and the section that's happened post refueling era. So we start at the beginning with the very first type of wheel nut. It was actually an off-the-shelf item which bought from a third-party supplier. We used that for 3 years, but it was very heavy, and we made the decision a little later into the refueling era that we would fit some big carbon discs to the front of the car that were attached to a wheel nut, and we knew at that point that we were going to be slowing pit stop times down quite considerably, but it didn't really matter because we were connecting a fuel hose to the car. We knew that normally the fuel load would be a minimum of 5 seconds, so we were quite happy with the 4-second tyre change at that time. So actually we went to a very simple, I think everyone would recognise, form of wheel nuts, and that stood us in good stead for 2 years. However, there was a point that it became very clear that we were going to get rid of refueling and that we wanted to spend the minimum amount of time in the pits possible. And that's really what kicked off the rest of the wheel nuts you can see here in the future development. We went to a lightweight wheel nut with a fairly similar drive system that you could see here, and the benefit of that is that basically the socket could engage very, very quickly, and this big groove here was a mechanism that held the nut into the socket. So once again I think we decreased our pit stop times by around about 2 seconds at that point in terms of wheel change times. It was a much more efficient system. But then we went from there to the next stage. The next stage was to have the wheel nut pretty much the same design, but actually captive inside the wheel, which I think everyone's familiar with nowadays. The big benefit of that was you can't lose the wheel in the pit stop, and also you're putting a new wheel nut on every single time you fit the wheel, and that's very important, especially with these aluminium wheel nut types, because the threads were prone to damage. You know, very light but very fast wheel change assembly. That naturally developed to this nut here. In this nut we have bittersweet memories of here in at Red Bull, because this gave us our fastest ever pit stop time in Austin, but also it was partly the reason why we lost a wheel in the pit lane with Mark Webber in Germany. So as I say, bittersweet memories there. And really that nut led on to this one, which we're still using now on the rear axle of the car. For the last few years we've alternated between the front and rear axle, having a small one. That's pretty much a standard bit of kit now, hasn't really changed much in the last 2 years. But what has changed is our desire, our aerodynamic desire to improve the car with a blown front axle, which as you can see started off with a much bigger axle end than we'd ever used before. Got even bigger and bigger again, and this is the wheel nut that we're using on the front axle of the car at the moment. It's very complicated assembly, very expensive assembly, but you know, as you can see, the difference between the front and rear axle of a car this year, that's what's required, and that's what we've developed. So 11 years of wheel nuts.
Ja, Piet, het is een heel zwaar gereedschap en dat gaat met hele hoge snelheden. En er zijn ook wel behoorlijk wat keren wat misgegaan. Dat je dus gewoon je polsen breekt, hè? Omdat zo'n ding gewoon helemaal uit je handen slaat.
Je doet er dan wat minderwaardig, of minderwaardig niet, maar die mensen die dat doen, dat is dan maar bijzaak. Maar dat is het eigenlijk niet, hè?
Nee.
Maar dat is toch wel een trucje op zich.
Nou,
Het is die mensen kunnen voor jou een race beslissen.
Ja.
Ja.
Daar moet je je niet in vergissen. Dat is hetzelfde met dat ene onderdeeltje wat in je injectiesysteem zit. Als dat het niet doet, doet je hele auto het niet.
Nee.
Dus het zijn de kleine. Het is een complex van factoren. En als er één kleinigheidje ontbreekt, gaat het gewoon mis. Zo simpel is het.
ja.
En dat is met zo'n mechanic, zo'n wielmonteur. Monteur. Zeg ik dat goed? Wielmonteur? Nou ja, dat maakt niet uit. Maar is dat
Wielmoermonteur.
Wielmoermonteur, ja. 6 keer de woordwaarde. Ja.
Ja, Scrabble.
Maar je ziet ook steeds meer auto's gewoon in het normale verkeer. Laatst heb ik een Porsche heb ik gezien en een McLaren ook, notabene. Ook met 1 centrale wielmoer. Ja. Die waar eigenlijk alles op centreert. Terwijl als je toch de meeste andere auto's, het is 4 of 5 gaats en 1 centraal naaf. En het centreert op de naaf en die zet het helemaal vast met wielbouten in de meeste gevallen.
Nou ja, dat is toch vroeger met die oude racewagens toch, maar alleen de sloegen ze met een hamer sloegen ze die... dat ding vast.
Ja, dat was een spinner.
Ja.
Een spinner. Dan had je inderdaad een sloeg met een hamer of met een bronzen bus. Gaan we er een tik op, spinnen eraf, wiel erop en dan de andere kant op. Het leuke is, als je dat niet... Bijvoorbeeld Alfa Romeo, die heeft aan de ene kant linkse draad, aan de andere kant rechtse draad. Dus als je dat niet in de gaten hebt, sla je zo die spinner in twee.
De wiel die kant op draait.
Die draait hem altijd vast.
Ja.
Nou, we hebben het nu over de bandenwisseling gehad. Maar dat wordt ook volgend jaar wel weer een dingetje. Want we krijgen natuurlijk hele andere velgen.
Ja.
En hele andere banden. Ook een heel ander veersysteem.
Ja.
We krijgen, nog sterker, hele andere auto's.
Ja, dat zit er wel in, ja.
Dus volgend jaar... en volgend jaar is al over 9 weken dat seizoen weer gaat draaien.
90 dagen volgens mij.
90 dagen, ja.
Dat gaan we los.
Ja. En dat gaat dan... dan zal het 12 weken zijn of 10 weken. Maar... het is gelukkig alweer heel snel.
Ja.
En ja, jongens, zeg het maar. Maar het kan zomaar zijn dat net zoals bij Ferrari... dat volgend jaar Mercedes een middenmotor is. Ja. Of Red Bull een middenmotor is. Of dat ze samen met Ferrari, McLaren en Williams... om de titel gaan strijden. Ik denk zelf... al alles waar ik erover gelezen heb, dat het wel eens zo zou kunnen dat we volgend jaar weer een WK-titel krijgen. Maar dat de WK-winnaar met 100 punten, 110 punten de winnaar is.
Ja,
we gaan het zien.
Omdat
wat baseer je dat op dan?
Nou, omdat het veel competitiever wordt. Dat is de bedoeling van die hele wijziging. Ja. Dus dat je waarschijnlijk mogelijk krijgt, net zoals vroeger, dat je dus coureurs hebt die 2 of 3 Grand Prix winnen. Een paar tweede plaatsen, een keertje 7e zijn, een keertje 9e zijn. Ja. Maar het totaal aantal punten...
Dat het allemaal wat dichter bij elkaar zit. Ja. En niet de eerste 2 bij elkaar zitten en de rest komt...
We hebben nu natuurlijk jaren gehad, vorig jaar 495 punten voor Hamilton. Ja. Met een Red Bull die daar als beste tweede achteraan komt met 285 punten. En de rest zit in de... dubbele cijfers en niet in de trio-cijfers. Die zitten in de tientallen.
Ja.
Nou, we zullen het zien. Ik ben heel benieuwd.
Dus ik hoop het. Want in die zin. Want dat betekent dat je eigenlijk elke race een soort finale krijgt. Weet je wel? En ik denk, vergis je niet. Wie komt er naast Hamilton te rijden?
Russell.
Juist. George Russell. Zat 1 weekend in de auto van Hamilton. Reed gelijk naar P1. Hè? Zijn auto hield er toen mee op. Voor het eerst dat de Mercedes story had uitgerekend.
Dat hebben ze in het hokje gedaan, denk ik.
Dat vermoed ik,
ik
dus
denk
kortom.
Kortom. Hij zat in een auto waar zijn stoeltje niet van aangepast was. En dan rijdt hem ook nog een beetje aan de voorkant.
Laat ik zo zeggen. Ik denk dat daarom Mercedes zo fanatiek was in het protesteren tegen deze uitslag. Omdat ik vermoed dat iedereen zich realiseert dat het WK niet volgend jaar zomaar weer even gehaald wordt.
Nou, laten we het hopen.
En ik denk dat datzelfde geldt voor Red Bull en hetzelfde geldt voor iedereen. Want ik vergis niet, er rijdt ook nog best wel heel veel ander talent ook rond. Hè? Noem een Leclerc, noem een Carlos Sainz, noem een Lando Norris, Russell. Weet je wel, het zijn toch...
Je hebt er allemaal een beetje keer vooraan gereden. Zo.
Nou ja, ik heb gehoord, ik weet niet of dat waar is, dat 50% van de rijders wereldkampioen kan worden in een goede auto.
Ja. Ja.
Dat heeft, ik heb mijn programma opgevangen.
Nee, dat klopt wel.
Je hebt 20 rijders, er zijn 10 die in de goede auto gewoon wereldkampioen
Dat zijn
worden.
allemaal die jonkjes.
Ja.
Ja. En daar hoort die Russell ook bij.
Maar ik denk dus dat volgend jaar meer zal gaan gebeuren. Denk ik. Maar goed, we zullen het zien.
Wat ligt aan de auto?
Wij gaan u hopelijk allemaal volgend jaar ook weer terugzien. In goede gezondheid. Van hieruit een goede jaarwisseling en fijne feestdagen.